Welcome to Speaking to Speakers, the podcast that brings together business leaders, coaches, keynote presenters, actors, voiceover talent, and anyone else who uses words and their voice to make their living. I'm Robert Mattson. Let's hear what they have to say.
So as long as I can remember, I've always enjoyed telling and listening to stories. And as a kid, I never really put much value in it or faith in the idea that my storytelling skills or my natural predisposition towards telling stories would ever be worthwhile or worth anything. But I remember being a kid and we were given this book at school where we were supposed to write short stories and illustrate them. And I would draw very crude drawings because I just wanted to focus on the story I wanted to tell. I wasn't that obsessed about the visual aspect of it at the time. I just wanted to get these ideas out. And I think it wasn't until I was about 14, 15, I started playing music, I got involved in theater, where I saw that I had a real knack for creating stories that got people engaged, got them to laugh, got them to feel something. And it's funny how it's sort of come in different chapters, my own story with storytelling, how I've gone from that creative side to then realizing as I entered into the corporate world that using that storytelling and especially coming at it from that different angle really lent itself a different weight and gravitas when it came to sales, public speaking, leadership, motivation. And it's come in those different flavors, but I think the methodology that I employ when telling stories and approaching them has in essence remained pretty much the same, funnily enough.
That is Jon Thor Sigurleifsson. I'm sure I'm doing a horrible job on your name, John. He is a storytelling professional, a teacher, a speaker, and he is out of England. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. Lovely introduction there. Makes me feel all important inside.
Well, I think everyone is important, and hopefully they feel it inside. But John and I actually met by happenstance, and after meeting him, I just thought this is a fantastic person with a great story, not only his story itself, but also what he does and the way he goes about it. So, John, could you share with the audience and the listeners, what do you do and how do you help people?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I do is I'm a bit of a polymath. I quite like that word. But for those of you not familiar with that word, think of me as a Renaissance man. If you're not familiar with that, there's Google. What I do and how I help people is quite varied, but in brief terms, I'm a sales and presentation coach. I do public speaking, and I'm one of the founders of a startup which has only recently started to sort of emerge in the public eye that aims to help job seekers and empower them with tools to be able to better land their dream position.
So you're basically telling them, tell your own story better so people can understand who you are and how they could help others?
Well, I'd say from the sales and presentation coaching, definitely. Mm-hmm. From the recruitment side, it's arming them with the tools they need to tell their story and be heard.
Sure. So John, you have a very interesting background, at least from my point of view. I mean, you grew up in Iceland, you moved to the UK, you spent some time in the US. Are there any differences in how people tell and listen to stories in different countries?
I'd say there are cultural differences in terms of storytelling, but at the same time, I'd say there's more differences within those cultures than between those cultures sometimes. And what I mean by that is, I think especially, and it's become such a cliche to use the internet for this, but the internet really has brought us together, and there are certain forms of storytelling and approaches that truly have been unified through things like the internet, like film as well. Some mediums that have been able to travel further than original word of mouth storytelling did back in the day. But I would say that there's a different flavor in how they listen to them more than how they tell them between countries. Because, like I said, within countries, people tell stories differently, etc. But in terms of that listening, I find, for example, between the UK and the US, there's this sense of extreme excitement in Americans often that I think many people visiting, they often almost feel like it's fake. They see it and they think, oh, they're so overblown. And I think it's because they see things like American Idol, America's Got Talent, these shows where people literally scream because they see someone who most people in the audience might not even know who they are. They go, this producer has produced these songs for these people. And everyone starts screaming and people go, oh, that's so American. And it's quite a common misconception, because what I found living over there is that people seemed genuine in their excitement to listen to stories. They bought into it very quickly. They want to be inspired, motivated, engaged. Whereas I feel there's a certain cynicism towards that sort of storytelling, especially from if you look at the corporate style of, the Tony Robbinses of the world, Jim Rohn, all of that. Over here, it's very often referred to as, it's so American, it's so this, it's so that. And while a lot of people buy into it, and I'm not at all saying that it's bad, but it's something that you have to recognize, in my opinion, as someone speaking in front of people, what is resonating. And if you know that something might be coming across cliche or cheesy for half of the room, the worst thing you can do is ignore it. The best thing you can do is call it out. I once did a talk where I literally asked the crowd, who in here really likes Tony Robbins? And it was a corporate crowd, so quite a lot of people put their hand up. And I was like, who loves Jim Rohn? Who loves Simon Sinek? And the same people were really excited. Then I went, who finds them to be pretentious, predictable, and cheesy? And there was a bit of hesitation. I was like, it's fine. Just tell me. I want to know. And probably about 30-40% of the room actually raised their hands. And I just started asking people, like, what is it about it that you find so pretentious? And people had different ideas, but they all came together and said, look, that doesn't motivate me. That doesn't work for me. And telling a good story has to mean something from the perceived value of the audience, because if you're blessed or privileged with the attention of a room, you need to respect that. You need to respect the time, the time investment, really, of the people that are sitting in front of you, in my opinion, at least.
Sure, and that's excellent points, by the way. And one thing that I see, in being a fan of British and Irish cinema, I usually find that the difference between the American cinematic stories and the British and the Irish stories is usually scale. Usually there has to be a huge backdrop. So there's an asteroid coming to destroy the planet, or, Thanos is snapping his fingers and getting rid of half of the universe. And in Irish stories, a lot of the films that I've loved growing up, Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels, which is actually an American version. Well, it's an English story, but very Americanized. But there's a lot of those smaller films that are more about what happened in the town, what happened to an individual, what happened to a small family, and the intricacies. So I think you're right. I think there's a kind of an American bombast that people expect out of American films. And so when they see an American film that is small in scale, I remember The Brothers McMullen, which was shot entirely on camcorders that did phenomenally well. It seemed like it was a European film because of just the scale of it. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's kind of a predisposed expectation of certain types of stories. And I think that carries throughout not just the entertainment world, but to the business world as well.
Yeah, and I think, you've hit upon a really interesting thing there. And knowing that we both have sort of theatrical and film backgrounds, there's a point to be made about that, I guess, whether it's a misconception or not, that, American films are these bombastic, huge things, that there are those. But then you've got, like, even if you look at someone like Quentin Tarantino, his films tend to be slow build-ups, long conversations that lead up to that bombastic finale, usually. And also, if you go sort of slightly deeper into some more, I guess, indie cinema, if you look at things like Ghost World, very character-driven. If someone asked me what happened in the film, it's like, well, some people talk about stuff that doesn't really matter that much, but they're very endearing characters. And I think the character-driven stories, if we go slightly deeper into it, there's an interesting point to be made about the character-driven stories of Europe versus the American dream, because the promise of America when it was first sort of founded was not a character-driven story; it was an idealistic story. And if you look at Avengers, if you look at the Armageddons and Day After Tomorrows of the world,
Mm-hmm.
they're films based on ideals. They're films based on big bombastic statements and happenings. And I think if you tie that in with what drew people over there, things like the Gold Rush, the Wild West, there are character-driven stories hidden within it, but it's not in its essence focused on that, one man's journey, one person's journey, even if it's not even a literal journey. Like you said, there are films often here that focus on one village. No one ever leaves. They just kind of talk about stuff. They just deal with life.
Well, if you're in Scandinavia, you're a person in a very gray background looking out at a wintry backdrop very sullenly. And that's kind of the stereotype that we see of Scandinavian cinema. But let's jump back into storytelling and different types of stories.
Yeah.
So what makes a good story? And is there a difference in telling a story in a pub on a Saturday night versus in a boardroom in front of a business group on a Monday morning?
So there's definitely a difference, but I'd say what makes a good story, at least from my perspective, is audience engagement. And whether that's through a book, a film, etc., it can't be a very good story if you cannot get yourself to go through it. And I've heard stories, whether it is in a pub on a Saturday night or in a boardroom or in front of a business, where if I had the chance to pause it and walk away, I would have. And I think some of the mistakes that people make when trying to make a story interesting or relevant is they focus either too much on the thing that's interesting to them rather than thinking of their audience. So as an example, if you're in a pub and you're just really, really into vintage cars, and you start telling everyone about this car that you're tuning up and the different tools you're using to make it run so beautifully, and you start talking about how Steve McQueen had one of those, or James Dean, if you're talking to people that literally couldn't care less about cars, the audience has almost automatically made your story irrelevant to them. However, there's a caveat where I can say that I've heard someone talk about things that I have no interest in, but their passion brought me along. Their passion was what engaged me. I once heard someone talk passionately about taxes for about half an hour. And if someone would have told me beforehand, this dude's going to talk about taxes, I would have given it a wide berth. But I was so passionate about the things that taxes and the correct implementation of them could achieve that I was just bought into his vision, into the mission that he was on. And in that way, I think you can make anything interesting and exciting for people if you understand how to get them on your side. But I do think there's difference in topics. You're unlikely to tell a story in a pub about the sales team and how it's going to hockey stick at the end of the quarter, or how using NLP on that one prospect and leading and mirroring and matching, and it's, unless you're with a sales team in the pub, it's probably not a pub story. But that again comes to the first point. Think of your audience. Yeah,
exactly. And I think to your point there, and as you're going through, 3 or 4 topics came to mind, which I think we could talk about for an hour and a half. But I think the main point that I'm picking up from that is it's less about the topic and more about how you connect with the meaning behind that topic. So if you're telling a story about how the sales team is going to hockey stick, don't tell me about the sales team. Tell me about, Jill, how Jill's been struggling all quarter, but then Jill changed one thing that she did. And this is what happened to her on a Tuesday morning. She had spilled her coffee, and she's got her, her top is covered with coffee, but she's going to keep on going. She's hiding it with her scarf. She gets on a call that she didn't want to get to with a prospect she didn't think she was going to turn. And suddenly it became the biggest deal of her quarter and changed her entire arc. That
Absolutely.
is a fabulous story to tell. And you and I both work with people in storytelling, and it's the details. People think that if they tell a general story, it will connect with people because it's general. No, 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 no. The details are what make the story connect to individuals. We all connect to detail. We all have spilled coffee. We have all, missed that last bus or missed that, had to sleep in the airport. Well, maybe not everyone's had to sleep in the airport. I had to
I've
do it
had
3
to.
times. Yeah. But it's a situation where telling those things like connect you emotionally with the individual. And then that carries the story because of that emotional connection.
Absolutely. And I think, to bring a slightly controversial quote in here, I think it ties into the whole idea that, the death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic.
Mm.
Because if I tell you about how 100 people made a lot of money by doing something, first of all, it immediately sounds like a pyramid scheme. Just throwing that out there. But secondly, those 100 people are faceless, nameless beings that you have no connection to. But like you said, as soon as you make that emotional connection, as soon as that person has a character arc, and you can see it in anything really. You don't pick up a book of fiction, and read about a group of people that did something, but you never find out more. Harry Potter didn't say the class of 96. And it's the same with business books. Robert Kiyosaki talks about himself, his father, his friend's dad. And if you read a few of his books, he refers to those same characters over and over again because people connect different ideas to those people. And they're no different really to archetypes in classic fairy tales.
Absolutely. And also the story arc is the same. You get your beginning, middle, and end, and you introduce your characters, and then you go through your conflict, and then you get to, your resolution. And we're wired to listen to that story arc. We all know how it works, and it's age old. But all right, so you've touched on what makes a great story.
Yeah.
But sometimes people have a great story, and to be quite honest, they tell it like crap.
Oh yeah.
So what makes a great storyteller? Because even if you have Hamlet, and I'm sure you've gone to see bad versions of Hamlet, and we all know it's a pretty solid script. So what makes a great storyteller from your point of view?
So I think a great storyteller, I think I want to sort of latch on to something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the details. And I'd say what makes a great storyteller is knowing which details to focus on.
Mm.
And I took this example recently when I was talking to a friend of mine about Dungeons and Dragons. So I was talking to her about a Dungeons and Dragons group I had when I lived in the States, and how the dungeon master was so brilliant at bringing stories to life. He would bring in sound effects. He would have all these different things for ambience. And my friend who's never played D&D said, well, does it really take a lot to be a dungeon master? You just have to tell a story. You just have to get people through an adventure. You just have it written down. And I said to her, well, look, you can have a fantastic story, but if you get too bogged down in details your audience doesn't care about, you'll lose them in an instant. And an example I took with her, and I took a story that she'd told recently, where I said, you were telling me about a story where you were traveling, and you spent about 5 minutes trying to remember the name of the town and the hotel in which this story happened. And I said, by the time you got to the point of the story, I just didn't care anymore, because to be honest, you could have told me it was in a different country and it wouldn't have changed the story. The setting wasn't the important bit. The name of the hotel brand that you were in didn't matter. You focused so hard on getting that one detail correct that made no difference to the story whatsoever. And that's a great, as an example, if we pull that example of, Jill, the salesperson, into it, it's like if you'd say, Jill was on her way to work. She missed the bus. No, actually, did she take the train to work? But no, she drove to work. She was just stuck in traffic for a while. But she comes into the office and spills, was it coffee or tea? I'm not sure. She spilled a drink, and on the rug So it was on the rug. So it must have been in the lobby, because upstairs there's tiles, and the rug, she had to clean the rug, and, Amy from reception had to come in, and it was just a great big mess. And then Jill, like at that point, like no one gives a crap about the eventual sales call anymore. People just want the story to be over, because you're focusing on far too much on the details that, to be honest, no one except for you cares about making.
And that's a great point, John, because when I talk to people, and often I'm helping corporations find stories, whether they're customer stories, personal stories, metaphorical stories. And a lot of times they'll say, well, it didn't quite happen that way. And I have to explain to them. I said, listen, what's the purpose of the story? Are you a journalist or are you a teacher? Mm-hmm. Because if you think about teaching stories and fables, the details don't have to be absolutely accurate as long as the core truth is there. So if it happened, in your office, but you want it to happen in a park, put it in a park.
Yeah.
No one's going to call you on it. And as long as the core truth is there and you're just adjusting things to make the story flow and to help the listener see the main point of it, yeah, totally fair game.
Oh, 100% agree. And I remember my brother once described a coworker of his as he's not the type of person that lets a small detail like the truth get in the way of a good story. Mm-hmm. And at the time, he meant it in a fairly derogatory way. But the thing is, I've met that coworker of his, and he's a great storyteller. And it's true that he doesn't allow those small details to alter, but he knows how to get people on his side. He knows how to make people listen. And I remember specifically, he told me a story about a project that he was part of and the reaction of some of the people as part of it. And the essence of it was completely true. And I'd seen him talk enough about these sorts of things that I knew which parts of it were him slightly spicing the story to make it a little bit more interesting or a little bit more heavy hitting. But at the end of the day, the point he was making was aimed to help those around him. He was looking to get people bought into an idea that would help get them across. And I think, like you said, whether a story happens in a park or an office or a hotel, it's not what matters. So I think a great storyteller has to be able to recognize the core of the story. And it's something you see in films as well, sure. Because if you look at, if we take an English filmmaker, Edgar Wright, one of my all-time favorites, and, he made Shaun of the Dead, he made Hot Fuzz, World's End, and each one of those films has a core component to their storytelling. Shaun of the Dead is in effect a film about a relationship and friendship, which just happens to happen within a zombie apocalypse. And, each of his films has an emotional center that just happens to be wrapped up in genre cliches. And that's actually where I think he had a bit of a misstep with Baby Driver as an example, where he had a film filled with film cliches and fun chase scenes and everything. But personally, and I know a lot of people felt the same, the emotional center of the film wasn't there. He'd lost touch with the core storytelling tool he had in his repertoire that really made his previous films land with people.
No, I get that 100%. And I've seen all those films and I've enjoyed all those films, but you're right. They were very different films. You wouldn't imagine them being created by the same person because of just the different approach that he took. So let's jump into a little bit of your background. So I know your background is in theater, so you're a thespian, and that helps you as a storyteller. You have an edge. But can anyone find their inner actor?
So I guess anyone can, but I think there's a risk to it. I think a lot of people that try to mimic actors' behavior or try to bring out, to your point, the inner actor, they can fall into a routine of fake it till you make it. They can fall into a routine of becoming a character. And I think especially from a corporate setting, I've seen people adopt a character while they're at work. I've seen them adopt a character whether they're on stage or they have to be this type of manager, type of salesperson. And you just see the disparity when you then meet them outside of it and you go, wait, which side is the real one. And I think what those people are trying to do is channel their inner actor. But I think when you look at truly amazing actors, like truly incredible people, Daniel Day-Lewis, or even going further back, you've got Laurence Olivier and the classics.
Isn't that Sir Laurence Olivier?
My sincerest apologies to the crown. No, and if you look at people like those two are enough, but some of the classics that truly bring a part of themselves even though they become their characters. And actually one of my favorite examples of it is Tom Hanks.
I was thinking Tom Hanks myself.
Yeah, because no one sees Tom Hanks and doesn't realize it's Tom Hanks.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you can't help but connect with the character. And it's not because he gets rid of everything that Tom Hanks is to become that character. It's because he reconciles who this character is with who Tom Hanks is.
Okay.
And yeah.
So I'm going to stop you there, because I think the great example of Tom Hanks, which is you go and you see a Tom Hanks film.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned Daniel Day-Lewis.
Yeah.
And when you see Daniel Day-Lewis in My Left Foot or Lincoln, now there is an actor, or was the Gangs of New York?
Yeah.
There's an actor who disappears within a character, and you forget it's Daniel Day-Lewis as you watch it. And I think you hit on something very important. When people find out that you're an actor, or when they find out that I'm an actor, they must say, "Wow, you must be a really great liar." And it's like, no, because they don't understand what acting is. Acting is finding the truth in a character and portraying that truth. And I think, to your point, where people try to put on a character, as in the business world, versus saying, who am I? What is my persona? Who am I? And how do I share that effectively with people? Because that's what actors do. They find the truth and they share it with people, versus bad actors, and I'm sure you've worked with some. They're the people that are putting up that facade. So I think that is, when someone finds their inner actor, they can go in one of two directions. The good interactor way, where they're finding their truth and sharing it, or the bad one where they're putting up that wall. And that's something I think is the difference between the good, the bad, and how people can do it in different ways. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And it's why, like I said, I love the example of Tom Hanks, because I feel like even if you just look at his personal life, and this is something that I feel quite strongly about, because I think any time we try to separate ourselves into different beings within work, and then within home, and then with friends, it just causes a rift. And I think part of what makes someone like Tom Hanks so successful in what he does is, if you look through his decades of his career, he hasn't been in the tabloids. He hasn't been in massive troubles. And I think it is, partially, sure, I realize that maybe his background has something to do with it, but as well, the fact that he comes into it as himself, he's never sacrificed who he is and how he does things to a point where he has to. And now he's at a point where he could probably choose whatever role he wants. So that what he's doing is, like you put very well, he's taking on the roles where he does find his truth very quickly, or very simply. He finds stories that he wants to tell and sees himself as part of it. And I think the people that put on that facade are, in many ways, they're jeopardizing part of their mental health for it. And you see it with actors as well. When they do disappear into those roles and start damaging personal relationships on the back of it, it's something you see in all different walks of life. And the biggest misconception around it, to me, is the idea that you have to, because we're multifaceted beings. We're not one-dimensional as human beings. Even though I probably seem slightly different on stage than I do sitting with a laptop working through some data or something, it's just because it's different facets of me. But if you then talk to me, I'll always be the same person. You always have the same core. But it's similar to finding that truth within a character. It's finding your strengths, playing to those strengths at the right times, and portraying those strengths in a way that still is uniformly you.
And people can sense it. If
Yeah.
you're the bad actor, if you're putting up the wall, if you're putting up the facade, people will know, and they sense the BS in the business world. Some guy or some woman comes up on stage, and they're like, "Yeah, you're just trying to sell me. You're trying to pitch me something. I'm not buying." And the smarter people will catch it all the time. All right, so John, you do something interesting. Now you post videos, I think, pretty much every day.
Yeah.
So you get up and you put on usually a very stylized shirt and a vest, and sometimes a snazzy bow tie.
Yeah.
And I've seen you do your videos, and I enjoy every one I see. So great work. Is there a difference between being a storyteller live and being a storyteller in front of a camera?
Yeah, I'd say for me it's a big difference in my own perception of it. But less so now than when I started. So when I first started, I'd already done some work in front of camera. I'd been in short films, advertisements, etc. So I wasn't nervous to be in front of a camera, but in all of the instances where I'd been on camera, I'd either been interviewed or I was playing a character. But then when I started doing videos on LinkedIn, I was addressing an audience that wasn't there. I was speaking into the lens of a camera phone, looking to engage with someone, but not in real time. And for the first few videos, I think the main, mindset shift I had to go through was, how do I create that engagement both for the people watching and for myself? And it took some time to, finesse my approach to it to the point where I felt, yeah, I know how to make it feel like that. Because one of the first things I was told when I made, I think the very first video I did, someone commented on how it felt conversational. It was nice because they felt like they had eye contact, because a lot of people make the mistake of looking into the screen of their phones as they're recording rather than the actual lens. And that really made me think, okay, I just need to make sure that I'm connecting in that way. And then it was just down to getting comfortable with, how do I make sure that my, quote unquote essence comes across? Because I've seen a lot of people, they get quite stiff. They try to do everything word for word. They might even have, a teleprompter. So you see them sort of leaning to the side and looking and checking that they're definitely doing everything. But to be honest, the more I've tried to do it the same as I do it on stage, the more it's felt natural. So I saw a massive difference in it to begin with. And there is a difference, but when I tried to reconcile the two and saw what can I bring from live presentations to the video, like, I have questions to the audience within the videos, and I look to have them answered in the comments, but it's the timing and the phrasing of the questions that's slightly different, because you're not getting an immediate answer. You can't bounce off of the audience. You can't gauge their reaction until afterwards. So to begin with, I was trying to have an entire conversation in the span of a video, but it was only me. When I realized, actually, the video should just be the conversation starter, and I started cutting down my video length to usually around 2 minutes. And then I think this is a conversation that started with my video, but continues in the comments and the messages, maybe even the video the next day and the next day. And that felt freeing, where I realized, actually, I'm taking something where live it might happen over the course of 30 minutes with a room of 50 to 100 people, just to make up a number. But with the video, it could be a 2-minute conversation starter that then lends itself to 100 comments over the course of 3 days.
I can see that. And I think that I picked up from that is about what I call owning the gist. You don't have to know it word for word. Just understand the main points you want to make. And some people say, well, I can't remember them. It's like, yeah, sure. Toss down a few bullets for yourself and just say, okay, I want to talk about, the weather in Poland. I want to talk about the economy in Brazil, and I want to talk about the effects of an earthquake in California. Great. Those are my 3 things. And I tell people, you're smart. You know what you want to talk about. You're the expert. So just get that done. But I love your idea of, you're starting the conversation and it can continue because it is a conversation, whether you're on stage or in front of a camera, because someone who's absorbing your content or what you're saying is replying to you either mentally or maybe even verbally. Or if you're on stage, and I'm sure you do it, you see those moments where you give a quick pause and you see those nods of heads, or that person checking their phone and you know that you've lost them. And it's a situation where, you have to create that conversation, whether it's in video or live. So I think that's some excellent points. So Jon, I want to ask you a few questions as we close.
Yeah.
So tell me, who's a storyteller that you really like and what's the reason you like them?
So the first one that comes to mind is John Mulaney.
For those of you not familiar with John Mulaney, he is a comedian. If we're talking about the same person, used to write for Saturday Night Live. He now has a number of Netflix specials. A very, very funny gentleman, lives in New York City. Why do you like John Mulaney?
I think because, he's a stand-up comedian, but first of all, I think I see my own style in sort of parallel with his style in the way that he's a stand-up comedian that does stand-up comedy that doesn't feel like it. He just feels like a storyteller that happens to be funny. He stands on stage in a suit and tie and talks to the audience. The audience doesn't always reply with much more than the claps and laughs and everything, but it feels genuine. There's a connection. Even if he's doing that story for the millionth time, for the millionth audience, and he's probably rehearsed it for his wife and his dog, but it feels in the moment. And he just always seems like he's having such good fun with it. But at the same time, he's never over the top. And it's something where, when I speak on stage, I don't jump on tables, Wolf of Wall Street style. I don't get people to stand up and shout and beat their chests. It's just not me. And when I've done comedy on stage, it's the same. I don't try to go over the top by, I don't have gross out humor. I don't try to push people's buttons with super controversial stuff just to be controversial. And I feel like he hits that real sweet spot of telling hilarious stories, which still feel genuine and feel like there's an emotional connection to it, because very often it's something that he just feels quite passionate about, even if it's literally just the way that Ice-T speaks on Law and Order, or how he's talking about the fact that he doesn't want children, but he's got this lovely French bulldog called Petunia. And even if you look at the animated show he does, Big Mouth, where him and Nick Kroll really dive deep into their childhoods and teen years. And for example, that show is at times quite sort of gross out humor-esque, but there's an honesty to it. Again, there's a vulnerability to taking those thoughts and experiences that a lot of people have as teenagers and just putting them out as bluntly as they do.
No, that's great. I'm a big fan of John Mulaney. As is my 13-year-old son, which means I'm probably not a very good father. But so, Jon, could you share with the listeners kind of a parting gift?
Yeah.
But for the storytellers out there, what's one thing that they should do and one thing that they definitely shouldn't?
So I think something they should do, and I kind of, again, want to tie this into something you said earlier about owning the gist. What you should definitely do is talk about what you're passionate about. And always make sure that you're adapting subjects and topics to your style and not the other way around. Because when I first started talking on a corporate stage, my instinct was, how do I make myself corporate? How do I fit into the topic? How do I go from talking about something funny or something different in a theatrical setting or something like that to talking about sales figures and team meetings and all this? But the moment I realized that I should just frame it in a way that I'm passionate about, because you see corporate people talk about sports all the time. Sports analogies are like the bane of my existence, because people are like, oh, be like the Manchester United team of 1987. I'm like, I don't even know the ones 2017 now, let alone 30 years earlier. And when I started actually just focusing on what I'm passionate about and started finding those parallels and everything, I didn't feel like I needed cue cards. I didn't feel like I needed to know word for word, because I knew that people don't care if you know your speech word for word. They don't know it. They don't sit there with a script of your speech and go, sorry, John, on page 43, you actually were meant to, like, no one does that. No one cares. People buy into your passion, your belief, and they feel when you're genuinely passionate about something. So definitely do speak from your heart, speak from passion, and definitely don't get too hung up on either the word for word recitement of what you're doing. Definitely don't overly rely on, flashy or overly wordy slides, and don't let the naysayers get to you. Because I think one of the most difficult things to do as a creative person in life is not learning how to accept criticism, but learning which criticism to accept. Because there are going to be people that you'll never win onto your side, but those people were never going to be supporters or fans in the first place. And it's something that I've had to really navigate in my music, where I have to know who my audience is, because my audience should be people that are passionate about similar music that I am. If I'm trying to play like abrasive, technical, mathcore music, and someone who loves Taylor Swift says it needs a catchy chorus, that might not be the person I'm trying to appeal to anyway. And in a similar way, if you're talking about passion or mental health in the place on stage, and some Wolf of Wall Street type goes, no, just talk sales figures. These guys buy into NFL references. That person might not be someone who has your best interest at heart in terms of storytelling.
John, that was just a truckload of wisdom you threw down, so I really appreciate that. But that's fantastic. Yeah, sometimes I tell people, right joke, wrong audience. And you have to, sometimes you just have to find your people. And I think you're right. If you speak from your heart and you speak your own truth, people will connect with it. I think the most powerful speakers are the ones who tell the stories that people will resonate with. And behind the heart of every salesperson is probably, is a daughter, a son, a mother, a dad. And they're not just their job. They're actually, they're real people. So even if you're talking to a CEO, they still fell down and stubbed their toe and scratched their knee when they were kids. And they will connect with that story as well. But John, this has been fantastic. We have had Jon Thor Sigurleifsson. He is a speaker, a teacher, a musician, an actor, a storyteller, a Renaissance man. He is all things to all people. And if you were ever in Bournemouth, England, and in those areas, you might find John somewhere around there. John, if people wanted to find out more about you, how could they do that?
Well, my LinkedIn page, like I said, has daily videos coming up. I've got a website that's constantly evolving, which is jon-thor.com. So just my name and if a hyphen there. And people can get in touch through those if they have any questions or thoughts. And the content that I put out, a pretty deep idea of what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis.
And we had a little internet issue, so that is Jon, Jon-Thor, THOR.com to find out more about Jon Thor Sigurleifsson and all the amazing things that he does. John, thank you so much for spending my morning and your afternoon with me, and look forward to maybe having you back.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening. Speaking to Speakers is sponsored by ITM Speakers, helping executives, sales staff, and subject matter experts become more effective and persuasive communicators. Learn more at itmspeakers.com.